Hello, everyone, and welcome to our How to Run a Voter Registration Activity event training today. I'm Sarah Strader, SFI's Executive Director, and I'm going to be stepping us through some content to help you feel confident this summer and fall running a voter registration activity in your local community. We're going to explore all the different options, answer all the many questions, etc. So let's get into it. What are we going to be covering in today's training? So we're going to start by establishing why it is so important that we all do as much voter registration activities as we can this summer and fall. Then we're going to step folks through the registration process. This may be a process you're familiar with already, but it's always helpful to get a debriefer, especially if you're going to be helping others. We're going to talk about through some FAQs that if you are registering other people in your networks, you might get asked. We want to help you feel equipped to answer those questions. And then finally, we're going to get into more logistics, nuts and bolts. What could an event look like and how do you go about making one? Hopefully this touches bases on what everyone's coming here for. So let's start with why this matters. Why is it so important that SFI is going to drone on and on about voter registration between now and November 8th? Well, look at this graph. In 2020, we all heard that it was a historic voter turnout election, right? And that was so exciting and encouraging. And then we got some data and we looked a little closer at that and we realized that for military voters, sure, folks came out, but not nearly as much as we hoped and thought. There was a 27% gap here. So military voters were 27% less likely to vote than their civilian counterparts. And that's even when controlling for demographic similarities and differences. So there's this big discrepancy between the representation that we see in our policies and it reflecting the lived experiences of those in our military community. And that's a gap that we are very passionate about helping close. And with your help that we can try to do that. So here's what we're up against, but here's what we have at our advantage. First of all, this kind of outreach works. So there's a term that's called relational voter outreach. This is when you're helping register someone to vote who either you know personally or you have some connection to, whether that's a shared affiliation or you have something in common. When you reach out to someone that you have this connection with, you are 10 times as likely to be successful at getting that person to register and getting that person to vote than when you're reaching out to a complete stranger with whom you have nothing in common. And let me just say, majority of get out the vote stuff happens at stranger to stranger contact. And so the type of voter registration activities we're talking about today are going to be way more efficient and way more impactful. So speaking of efficiency, why is this the case? Someone is way more likely to answer your call or listen to what you're saying or take action if they know you or they see that they have an obvious connection to you. And we're also going to talk about events where you're showing up where people are already at. That is a great way to get someone to take an action because they're waiting in line for something. They might as well use that time productively, right? So the kind of voter registration activities we're talking about, they're efficient, they're worth your time, they're impactful, and they expand the capacity of what else is out there. So like I said, a lot of get out the vote activities that happen like in our civilian world, they happen through either political campaigns or other nonprofits that tend to not have a military connection. And as a result, they tend to not reach out to our community. So political campaigns don't often reach out to us because they see us as absentee voters. We're not as impactful. They don't tend to prioritize military voters. And a lot of nonprofits that may be reaching out to military voters don't always know the ins and outs of what it means to be a military voter, what forms you need and that kind of thing. So the work that we do as a community to serve ourselves and people in our community expands that capacity in a really important way. And finally, everything that we do, whether it's talking about how important is voting or taking the next step in running an activity, what we're doing is we're making a community of civic engagement within the military more normal, more typical, and more accessible. So these are all of the reasons why everything we're talking about today is important, and we're so glad that you're here to learn more. Now, as promised, if we're going to ask folks to help register to vote other people, we better clarify what it looks like to register to vote. I hope this doesn't overwhelm anyone, but we went ahead with huge, and I want to give huge special thanks to Kate Marsh-Lord on our team, our communications director, who designed this super awesome, nifty flowchart that I am so proud of us for. This flowchart is a really quick step-by-step way to determine what kind of voter are you, not who you're voting for, but what category of voter are you, and how that shapes which voter registration form you're supposed to be using. So feel free to pause this training here if you want to read the flowchart. You can take a screenshot. At the end, we're going to give access to a downloadable PDF guide where this flowchart is in there, so you can get the document that way as well. But essentially, it asks people, by asking questions, it steps us through, okay, are you a local voter where you need to use kind of the regular voter registration form? Or are you an absentee voter? And if you're a long distance voter through the military, then you get this special form, which is great. It's called the Federal Postcard Application. And instead of making you figure it out, we answered these questions for you. So real quick, if you are someone who is connected to the military, and because you're connected to the military, you live somewhere that is different from where your state of residence is, that makes you an absentee voter, a long distance voter, a UACAVA voter. You could call yourself any one of these names, but it basically means that you should be using this special form. It's called Federal Postcard Application, FPCA, and we'll get into why that form is so important. But this is the piece that most people miss, right? We think that we're all stuck using civilian voter registration forms, but if you're in this category of voter, you actually get your own form. Whereas if you are voting local to where you live, either you're in the military and you just so happen to be living at the place where you're a resident formally for tax purposes, or you're out of the military or something like that, that's when you will use those local voter registration forms. Like I said, you can pause this and look at it later, but that's a quick overview. Now, I've already used this jargony term a couple times, state of residence or place of residence. What the heck am I talking about, right? Because as we all know from this picture, we have tons of different addresses we could be referring to. Which one are we supposed to use as our residence? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Your state of residence for military spouses, troops, other dependents, this is the place that we call home, even if the military makes us move temporarily somewhere else. And ultimately, where we consider home is a choice. Some of us keep an official home residency, the same one, throughout our entire military career, even as we might temporarily move all around the world. Some people choose to change their residence, change where they call home every time they move. And both of those are totally valid choices. Some factors to consider when you're making this choice for yourself, or if someone else you know is making the choice. Often people will make this choice based on economic factors. So I want to maintain residency in a state that has favorable state tax policies, for example. Or I know that this is the state where I want my kids to go to university, and so I want to be a resident through this state so that I get in-state tuition, something like that. But economic factors aren't the only things to think about. There are also emotional reasons, like I want to maintain ties back home where I started, or I want to maintain ties to where I expect us to retire, my future home. Or maybe it's simply, I know where I want to vote, and therefore I'm going to make that place my home. All of these reasons are personal and equally valid, and we just like to make sure folks know all of the different things that they should be thinking about. Now, I've got a fun fact for you. If you are a military spouse, there is this law, Military Spouse Residency Relief Act, or MSRA, that says that you, a military spouse, are allowed to have the same state of residence as your service member, even if you've never lived there yourself. So let's say you met your service member after they had already had a couple PCSs behind themselves, and their state of residency is from one of those past assignments, right? Like, I don't know, Alaska. And you meet them when you're both living in Illinois. You get married, you move to California, but your service member still has that Alaska residency. Even if you have never set foot in the state of Alaska, you're allowed to use their residency as your residency. You don't have to, you can have your own residency. But I think that this is a kind of like bonus cool fact that it's fun for people to know about. Now, real quickly, I just want to clarify, there are a lot of terms that get thrown out that where people are trying to say state of residency, but instead they'll say home of record, for example. Technically, these are two different concepts. So home of record is that address that you had at the very beginning of that military career, where you enlisted from or where you went to academy from. And that kind of stays permanent throughout your career. I think you get one chance to change it at the very end, just in case you want your household goods shipped to a different address. But for all intents and purposes, your home of record is like your stable, permanent origin point. Your state of residency starts at being the same address as your home of record. But as you move around, you can change your state of residence however often you want. So anytime you PCS, you can say, I want my residency to be here, even as your home of record does not change. So I think that's an important distinction, and people get it mixed up a lot. Also, it could be the case that you have a driver's license or another form of state identification that is from your state of residency. But let's be real, a lot of us get driver's licenses local to where we're currently living because we need some form of identification, and it's really complicated to keep that driver's license updated from back home. And so sometimes our driver's license may not match where we're a resident, and that's okay. Just don't think that you're limited. You can only vote where your driver's license is from. Those two things can be independent. So a better determination is you're trying to figure out which address is my state of residence. Think about tax forms. So for your service member, it's going to be their leave and earnings statement, their LES. If you're formally employed, it's typically the address you've put on your, W-2 or W-4 in order to determine which state gets your state taxes. That is your state of residency. If you're not formally employed, you don't have this quick shortcut, unfortunately, but this is the closer equivalent to where your residence actually is. Hopefully we've answered many questions simply with this one slide. But why is this so important? Because this makes a big difference as to how you register to vote. Like I said earlier, if you're a local voter, you're going to be using local civilian channels. So how do you register to vote if you're a local voter? If your state of residence is the same place where you're also living right now, you use the form anyone else in your neighborhood would use. So you can go to your state's election commission website. You can fill out the form. Some states let you fill it out directly online. Others make you send it in by the mail, just depends. And every state, every locality is going to have different deadlines and different requirements. So just make sure that you read super closely. We have a central form at SFI. If you go to our website, this is our homepage. If you click the vote button here, it'll take you to a voter registration form that works everywhere. It is a national voter registration form. It learns based on which state you're registering in, what information your state asks for, and it kind of adapts the form accordingly. So again, this is a great kind of one-stop shop if you're a local voter, if you're registering local to where you currently live. Now, not all of us fall in that category, right? A lot of us vote somewhere that's far away from where we're currently living. And that makes us an absentee, long distance, or UACAVA voter. What does UACAVA stand for? Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. It's about the law that made this possible. You don't have to worry about that. It's not going to be a pop quiz. But it basically means that you get access to this special form. It's called the Federal Postcard Application, FPCA, and it is a single form that all of us who are absentee military affiliated voters get to use, no matter which state we're voting in. You can find this form at ffap.gov to register online. If you're in person at a base, you can go to your voting assistance officer at that base, and they should have copies of this form there as well. We also link to this on our website, but this form is really nifty because it lets you register to vote for the first time. It also lets you simply update your information. So even if you're already registered, but something's changed, like your last name or your mailing address, you can use all the same form for that. It lets you get an absentee ballot simply by being military affiliated. So you don't have to like make a case to your state election official as to why you deserve this. And it gives you extra rights, kind of. So it does require election officials to make sure that you get your ballot at least 45 days before an election. That is super useful. We all know that it takes a long time with mail delivery to show up. And so having that extra buffer is really important. And if something goes wrong, if you've used the FPCA, it gives FFAP, the official DoD agency in charge of absentee military voters, it gives them insight into your situation so that they can help intercede on your behalf. So definitely take advantage of this form and all that it's good for. I will say there's only one downside to this form, and that's that you do have to fill it out every calendar year when there's an election you're going to vote in. That is the one downside. But hey, set that reminder, January 1st, every year, fill out a new FPCA, get yourself sorted. That's the best way to deal with it. Okay, so we've talked about what it means to register to vote. You have to figure out what kind of voter you are, and then you have to use the appropriate form. Hopefully we've made it simple and easy. Now we're going to talk about, okay, I understand the voter registration process, and now I'm talking to other people about this, and I'm encouraging them to register to vote. I'm helping them register to vote. What are some questions that I can expect that I might get asked? Because if we can anticipate that, we can feel a lot more confident going into that voter registration activity. Now, of course, there's tons of questions you can get asked, and most of them are probably going to have to do with residency, right? Because that's the complicated piece. Hopefully, we've given you all the information you've needed to know in order to give someone some guidance on figuring out their residency. But we thought about a handful of other questions that either we've been asked at SFI or volunteers in our network have heard of. And so we wanted to touch on those real quickly. So if someone asks, oh, I can't remember if I'm registered or not, how do I know if I'm already registered? It's been a long time. The easiest thing to do is say, we can help you with that, and use that voter registration form that's on SFI's website. The great thing is it's not just a voter registration form, it's also a voter registration check. So it'll let you know if the information you've put in already exists somewhere on an election roll, and that'll quickly answer someone's question. Someone might ask, I know I've registered before, do I have to do all this stuff again? So if they're a local voter, the answer is probably not. But like I said, if they're a long distance voter who's used the federal postcard application, which is great, and they should be doing that, it does mean that they do have to do it every calendar year. So this means that no matter who you're talking to, even if they've registered before, chances are there's an update that they need to refresh their registration materials. And it's a good practice to get into anyway. As we all know, some states decide to purge their voter rolls every once in a while, and military addresses are highly susceptible of getting accidentally purged. So it never hurts to, even if you know you've registered before, make sure all your stuff is up to date. If people are asking you when they have to get around to doing this, obviously our answer is always as soon as possible. But at very least, if you've not been able to convince someone that today is the day they need to do that, let's say they're still deciding if they want to vote, or they're waiting to get their mailing address at their new duty station if they're in the middle of a PCS or something, definitely encourage them by September 20th. That is the best date we can give to encourage people to get their information in by. Why September 20th? Well, it's a week later when they should be getting those absentee ballots 45 days before an election. So we want to make sure that they register in time to get that extra buffer. I know, September, we don't think about elections till November. Well, for a lot of military voters, November is way too late. So again, make sure to convey urgency, action today, and at very least by September. We got this question recently. If you're currently living or stationed overseas, there seems to be some doubt as to whether you're allowed to vote in a local election or a state election, or whether you can only vote in federal elections. And the answer is an enthusiastic yes. You have access to local and state elections. You can and should be voting in all of them. Finally, we all know that it's easy to feel like our individual vote, maybe it won't make a numeric difference. So why should I go through all the trouble of registering to vote or casting a ballot if it's not going to change anything? And so I know this isn't a question you might get asked, but if it's pushback you hear, we want to give you some good responses. So I'm going to give you a short answer and a long answer, and you can decide which one to use. The short answer: military ballots have in the past made the difference in key elections. The election in 2000 and the election in 2020 are both elections in which in certain states, certain swing states, the military vote margin made the difference and elected a president. And so I think that's really important to point to history and be like, see, short answer, our votes do make a difference and they do matter. Now, here's a little bit of a longer answer. Even if your individual single vote doesn't make the difference between candidate A or candidate B winning in this particular election, every time that you vote, you create a voting record. So it shows up on your state's voter file that this person is registered to vote here and has voted in the last, 2, 3, 4 elections. That is really important because when you're a candidate running for office or deciding whether you want to run for office, you're often going to look at data like that to decide, who should I be reaching out to in my district? Whose opinion matters? What age group, what gender, what racial, what ethnic, what economic background? Who are the people who actually show up to vote? Those are the people that I'm going to prioritize with outreach and I'm going to listen to. So when you make that reliable personal voting record, you are making it increasingly likelihood that candidates and ultimately elected officials are going to keep your lived experience in mind as they build public policy. And that is a permanent difference that happens every single time that you vote, no matter the outcome of any one-off election. I know I get a lot of encouragement by that. I hope you do as well. And hopefully if someone asks you this skeptical question, they'll take this answer as a good one as well. I will flag, these aren't the only questions you might get asked, of course, but we're here to be supportive and we're here to help. So we have 2 resources that you might like. On our website, we have an FAQs post. I think it's got 10 or 20 questions beyond what we could fit into a single slide. And we've gone ahead and responded to those questions there. So please, we're going to put those in either the chat or the comments of this video. And make sure that you check out that FAQ. You have it preloaded whenever you do your voter registration activity. And then we also wrote a blog post that went into more detail about the absentee ballot process, because we got a lot of questions from people. Oh, I'm voting through the mail. How do I know if it's secure? How do ballots even get counted? How do I know that ballots don't get double counted? We were getting lots of questions about kind of election mechanisms. And we thought it was really important to kind of explain, hey, if you're a military voter, chances are you have or will use this absentee voting process. We want you to understand how it works. So that blog post is also really great, not only for your own edification, but again, potentially responding to questions that you might hear as you go about registering folks to vote. Everything I've done up until now has been leading to this. This is our goal. This is what's most important, that we take all of this cool information that we're learning and all of this passion for the value of voting, and we channel it in a direction where we help make an impact on the voter participation gap that we talked about at the beginning. We're really encouraging folks, again, sometime this summer or early fall, please lead a voter registration activity. I promise it'll be worth it and it'll make an impact. Now, like I said earlier too, we have created a comprehensive guide that should be everything it needs to be to help you run that voter registration activity. So the purpose of today's training is to complement this guide. This guide is going to go into way more details. It's got, that step-by-step how to set up an event. It's got a little bit of a script. It's got some sample posts if you want to do a digital voter registration drive. And it's got all in one place, all of the various forms and links that you might need to download, to print, that sort of thing. So this guide is going to be your go-to to running an activity. But like I said, this training is meant to supplement that. And so we're going to just talk about some stuff related to that guide. So before you decide what kind of voter registration activity do I want to do, I think it's helpful to think about who the people are that you're most passionate about helping. So when you think of getting out the vote, do you think of getting out your friends to vote, your family to vote, members of community groups you're part of, other people that you see casually on a regular basis, people you work with? Thinking through all of the relationships that we have and the networks that we're part of is a good way to think, okay, if I want to reach this group of people, this is the best way to do it, either online, in person, you name it. So this is a good place to start. Again, you can pause, screenshot this form if you want. But I think it's fun to, I know some military spouse volunteers in our network have thought, they've been stationed, let's say overseas at the time, and they're like, I see all of these new spouses getting stationed here for the first time, especially young spouses, 18, 19, 20-year-old spouses. They're new to the military, they're new to this country. How do I help them belong and feel connected? That is a great example of like identifying a person or a group that you feel most drawn toward helping, because that'll shape your strategy, right? So now we're going to give you a couple options of what these strategies might look like. So option number one is doing some form of in-person voter registration activity. Kind of one example is doing a pop-up voter registration table that is connected to an existing either resource or event. So think about like the commissary or an off-base grocery store that a lot of military people go to. You could set a table up outside there. We've heard of volunteers plugging in with whatever their installation's readiness center or a place where families can get information and resources. We've heard of volunteers setting up a table every Wednesday between 2 and 4 at that readiness center. That's a great example. Occasionally, there will be events. Sometimes it's a multicultural dinner or a base barbecue. These are one-off events that you could add a voter registration table at. So here's something where you're taking existing infrastructure and you're kind of coming alongside and being like, also voter registration. This is one great example. But you shouldn't feel limited to that. You can also do your own standalone event. Maybe you reach out to the local military spouse club that you're either a part of or not, and you say, hey, I would love to have at the next meeting, I would love to talk about voter registration. Maybe you host a brunch or a happy hour event where it's part socializing, part voter registration. And that can happen at like a coffee shop down the road from the base. Or of course, you can always have a house party, which is a fun social thing as well. So these are examples of standalone events you can easily prop up that are fun to do, that help us make friends and invest in existing ones, and are all things that we've heard of other people doing successfully. Real quick, if you do an in-person activity, here's just a couple tips to help you succeed. So first of all, there are these things called voting assistance officers. I think I mentioned earlier in today's training. These are the official DoD service member who gets this extra duty to, like, in addition to their day job, they also are a resource for all questions related to voting. They are a great person to at least introduce yourself to and to meet and to maybe even talk about like, hey, how can I be helpful with your work? Now, it's important to know VAOs are usually charged with responding to inquiries. So most VAOs don't do a lot of proactive outreach. And their primary audience for their information are troops themselves, active duty members, rather than, say, a spouse or a dependent. So what you're offering when you approach your local base's VAO is like, I'm offering to help expand your reach by talking to spouses in addition to the troops that you're asking, that you're answering questions from. So that's really important to flag for them, is that you're trying to help them and complement the work that they're already doing to expand their impact. Now, I'll just give a bit of a realistic warning. Not every VAO is going to be equally communicative or enthusiastic about this. And so don't be discouraged. If you try to contact them and you don't hear back, or you don't get a lot of excitement in return, that's okay. You're not alone. I would think of this as like a nice box to check if you can, but you do not need your VAO's buy-in in order to do a number of these activities. So it's like a nice thing to have, but it's not a necessary requirement, and you shouldn't stop if you don't get it. That said, real quick, that said, we have heard a few success stories of spouses working with their VAOs, so we know that it's possible. Okay. In lieu of identifying a great solid connection with your voting assistance officer, there are other validators in your community who can be really helpful to get collaboration from. So maybe it's the leader of your spouse club, or a command spouse who's also passionate about voting, or a chaplain on base. Sometimes they'll partner in this kind of an outreach. Again, your goal is to get someone who can just help make things easier, whether that's helping promote something so you get more attendance, or whether it's kind of validating that by being affiliated with your event, they're assuring you that this is safe, nonpartisan, it's all good. Again, this is not a requirement to do a voter registration activity, but it's a really nice asset to have. And regardless of whether they're highfalutin or not, it's always great to have volunteers because they help. Teamwork makes the dream work. And so whether you're posting in your base's Facebook group in order to recruit for volunteers, or whether you already have friends and neighbors that you can, drag their arm into helping you, it's really great to get multiple people on board with whatever activity you're doing, because it's way more fun that way. And finally, just a real quick difference when it comes to in-person events. If you're going to be doing something on base, like having a voter registration out table outside the commissary or associated with an event, the easiest, least bureaucratic way to do that is for it to be unbranded. So in other words, you are just an individual military spouse, passionate about registering people to vote, setting up your own thing. You don't have to be affiliated with SFI. And in fact, sometimes if you say that you're representing a nonprofit, a base might have extra questions or extra forms that you have to fill out, and it gets complicated really quickly. That said, if you do something that's off base, like that happy hour example that I gave, that's totally off base. You can decide to be as branded as you want. So you can, state yourself as an SFI voting ambassador. You can talk about SFI as much as you want. That stuff is all free reign and a lot less complicated. So just wanted to flag that for folks. But in-person events are not the only form of voter registration activity that you can get involved in. You can also use a text or phone banking type format. So what would this look like? Well, it's calling someone you know, and it's chatting for only about a few minutes. Doesn't have to be a long conversation. You start by catching up with someone, and then you can kind of pivot. And one example for how you could pivot is saying, hey, there's an important election coming up, and I want to make sure you are ready to vote. I think this is a nice, unassuming, easy way to go from, hey, we're friends talking about our kids or our vacations, to, by the way, voting, right? It's a tricky step, but this is an easy way to do it. Now, when someone responds, one of the best things to ask for in this conversation is ask for someone's plan. So maybe they'll like, yeah, I'm going to vote. If you can get someone to be like, oh, okay, what's your plan for voting? Are you an absentee voter, or have you found your polling place, or that kind of thing? These are important questions because they can have someone actually visualize, oh, this is what it means for me to vote. And in visualizing it, not only does it increase the likelihood that they will go out and do that, but it also helps them think ahead of different obstacles they might face. So maybe they are an in-person voter and they're like, oh yeah, I need to find my polling place. I should look that up. Ta-da, you've prompted this thought process. Very, very helpful. And then finally, if someone does kind of struggle, like, I don't know, am I registered to vote, or I don't know where my polling place is, those are great things that you can help them with using the tools and resources on SFI's website. So like I said, whether it's calling someone or texting someone, depending on your comfort level, this is another great relational voter outreach tool where you don't even need to leave your house. If you're like me and you're 8 months pregnant and you get really cranky when you go out into the hot humidity, I like this alternative. Here's a little form that you can use to think through people in your life who you might want to contact with this phone or text bank. Again, feel free to pause, screenshot, use this form. And finally, the third format of a voter registration activity that we wanted to share is that of digital. So using your social media platform to get someone's attention and encourage them to vote, especially good if you want to have a broad impact and if texting and calling isn't your thing. Our voter registration guide, that PDF document I talked about, it's going to have tons of graphics and sample posts. And all you got to do is copy paste. If you want to adapt them to yourself, you can. So I am not going to repeat any of that here because you're already going to get it there. I just thought that I would give a couple funny memes and reflect on some keys to success. So when you're reaching out on digitals, you want to emphasize A, the importance of voting, B, the urgency of taking that voter registration action today, not putting it off, not procrastinating. And C, you want to strike a balance between being informative, but also being fun. You want to demonstrate to folks in your network, I have the answers. I am here to help. Use me as a resource. But you don't want to get preachy about it. You don't want to be heavy-handed. You want to make it feel like something we're all doing together, because that's what it is. And so some of these memes give different examples of different vibes. You know, maybe you're the very polite little cute cat. Maybe you're the obnoxious loud megaphone. Maybe you're the kind of creepy and threatening Liam Neeson. Whatever your vibe is, whatever your tone, I think they all have a place. And strike that balance, like I said, of reminding someone, but being kind of fun about it. All right. We're now at the end where we've touched on nearly everything so far that we've got planned. We've talked about what it looks like to register to vote, answered some questions that people might ask you, and then thought through logistically, what could an event look like? And we're going to point you back to that guide to help answer some nuts and bolts questions. But we felt we'd be remiss if we closed this training without addressing some concerns that may or may not be lurking in your mind and heart as you consider going about a voter registration activity. Who's thought this? Oh, this stuff kind of feels awkward. What if someone gets mad at me? Listen, I get that feeling. I felt that before, especially I have done canvassing, like door knocking for like candidates and that stuff. It can be very easy to feel discouraged, like, oh, I'm so awkward. I'm entering someone's home. I really want to encourage you to put this doubt aside though, because the chances are when you're reaching out to someone you either know or have this obvious military connection with, 9 times out of 10, people appreciate the reminder. They appreciate that visual, like, oh yes, I have every intention of voting and I would have kept forgetting or kept procrastinating. Thank you for reminding me. Plus, I should flag, what we're doing is not partisan and it's not about persuading someone to change their beliefs. That kind of work is exhausting and can be very awkward. All we're doing here is persuading someone to take an action that's in their self-interest, an action chances are they wanted to do anyway. So truly, from our experience and the experience of our volunteers, you should not be afraid of this awkwardness or anyone responding too madly. Those are few and far between, and you shouldn't expect that to come out. Now, it's easy to think, oh, well, if I'm putting myself out there as a resource, what if I don't have all the answers? What if they start asking me questions and I don't know? That's okay. You can totally say that you don't know. That is totally allowed. In fact, it makes you a more relatable human to the person who's asking you those questions. And you can always look up the answers later. You can either Google it or please ask us. Reach out any time of day. Just this morning, I was helping coach someone through some questions that she had heard about residency stuff. We want to be available to you to answer all those questions. So don't be afraid. Don't feel like you need to be an expert before you go out there. Go out there and then get the answers as you go. And finally, the perennial concern for military spouses. Anytime I do anything that's voting, elections, politics, whatever, am I going to hurt my person's career? Is my service member going to be penalized because I look too political? And I just want to assure you, when we're talking about voting, we are talking about civic engagement. All of this is nonpartisan. None of this is stuff that should be flagging for anyone, truly. Now, there are ways that you can make this partisan, in which case we really strongly discourage that, because not only is that less likely to be effective, but that is the kind of stuff that might get you or your service member in trouble. But if what we're talking about is voting and getting out the vote, no matter who someone's voting for, that stuff really should not cross any, it definitely doesn't cross any lines, and it shouldn't get anyone rankled. So again, we want you to go out there with a lot of confidence. Well, that sums up our training for today. I hope it's been helpful. And as you can see from this slide, we want to be as accessible to you as possible. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or inquiries at any of these through our website or any of our social media channels. We also have a TikTok that's not on this slide. You can message us there too. And I just want to quickly say, if you sign up to be an SFI voting ambassador, if you take the pledge that, in some way, shape, or form, you are going to commit to doing a voter registration activity this summer or fall, that's where all the good stuff happens. Once you sign up on that form, that is when we'll reach back out with this digital guide that I talked about, this downloadable PDF that's got all of the great resources. You also will get a chance to get a free t-shirt. So if you're looking for extra voting swag, we've got you covered. And finally, we wanted to share as well that folks who are voting ambassadors for SFI this summer and fall, if you take on a voter registration activity that has some costs associated, we are going to be able to offer a stipend that can help reimburse some of those costs. So we don't want you having to pay out of pocket for those snacks or those printed forms or that kind of thing. We're able to support you financially in that way as well. So please fill out the form, become a voting ambassador. Let's work together to do some awesome voter registration activity this season. Thanks, everyone.